Welcome to the online learning modules for exercise prescription guidelines. This is the second of 4 modules that you will be watching. We ask that you do not look up any other materials in regards to the information that you are about to see. Feel free to take notes throughout if you would like. For more information on the topics covered in this module, please visit the host website of exerciseprescription.web.unc.edu. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this module. This second module is on the American College of Sports Medicine's guidelines for resistance training. It is important to note that these modules are focused on the guidelines for sedentary, healthy individuals. Now let's review from the last module what the FITT-VP principle is. All of the guidelines are based on the FITT-VP principle for exercise prescription. FITT-VP stands for the frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, and progression of exercise. We are going to begin with the first letter of the FITT-VP principle, or the frequency of physical activity. The ACSM defines the frequency of physical activity as the number of days per week dedicated to performing physical activity. As you can see here, the ACSM recommends that healthy, sedentary individuals resistance train all major muscle groups 2 to 3 days per week. Major muscle groups refers to the muscle groups of the chest, shoulders, upper and lower back, abdomen, hips, and legs. At least 48 hours should separate training for the same muscle group. We just went over that the ACSM recommends resistance training all major muscle groups 2 to 3 days per week. Now let's talk about how to achieve this in its relation to split versus whole body workouts. A split resistance training workout is when a person trains only selected muscle groups in a training session. For example, a person might train the lower body muscles, such as the legs, hips, and glutes, on Tuesday and Friday, and the upper body muscles, such as the chest, shoulders, upper back, and abdomen, on Monday and Thursday. This would allow for 48 hours between training sessions for a muscle group. The benefit of this type of workout is you are able to focus on certain muscle groups for a longer period of time during a training session, which can improve muscular endurance or hypertrophy depending on the volume of exercises performed. Split workouts, however, would require a person to resistance train 4 times per week because they would need to hit each major muscle group 2 times. A whole body resistance training workout is exactly what it sounds like. It focuses on targeting all of the muscle groups in one training session. Whole body resistance training programs are usually recommended for beginners. Now onto the second category of the FITT-VP principle, or the intensity of exercise. In the previous slide, we said that the ACSM recommends resistance training 2 to 3 days per week for each major muscle group. Now we will look at the intensity that is recommended during these training sessions. First, let's go over a few terms. Repetition maximum, or RM, is the maximal amount of weight lifted one time only, then fatigue. 1 RM is the maximal exercise test for strength. The ACSM recommends that movements are 40 to 50% of a person's 1 RM for sedentary individuals looking to improve strength. This is classified as light intensity activity. After about 1 month of an individual performing 2 to 3 sessions per week of this light intensity resistance training, they can progress to 60 to 70% of their 1 RM. This intensity is recommended to improve novice to intermediate exercisers' overall strength. We will go into the progression of resistance training in a little bit later in this module. We just went over the recommendations for intensity based off a person's 1 repetition maximum or 1 RM. Now let's look at how to determine that 1 RM. Again, a 1 RM is the maximum weight an individual is able to lift with good form through a full range of motion. Typically, the chest press and leg press exercises are used to measure the 1 RM for the upper body and lower body muscular strength, respectively. For this slide, we're going to look at the protocol for the bench press. It should be noted that the 1 RM tests increase the risk of injury because it tests the maximum amount of weight a person can lift for 1 repetition. Therefore, we're going to recommend submaximal testing to be performed to predict the 1 RM. So the equation and chart seen in this slide is from a study conducted by Matt Bryzecki from Princeton University. The citation for this article is at the end of this module if you're interested in looking into it. But the position for the 1 RM bench press is a person lays supine on a flat exercise bench with feet pointing forward and the back in a neutral position. A spotter should be used. To warm up, a person should complete 5 to 10 repetitions at a low resistance followed by 1 minute rest. Then they should add 10 to 20 pounds or 5 to 10% of the initial load and perform 10 repetitions. They should then rest 2 minutes. Then they should repeat steps 2 through 3 until the person is unable to perform 10 repetitions with proper form or due to muscular fatigue, so them choosing no longer to perform the exercise. Once they reach this point, they can then use the following equation, which is pictured at the bottom of your screen, to calculate their 1 RM. Now, you may remember this slide from the cardiorespiratory module. The overload principle also applies to resistance training. Let's now apply this to a resistance training session where a person is performing dumbbell chest presses for a set of 10 repetitions. This exercise is depicted in the picture on this slide. During this exercise, the person is going to flex at the elbows and slowly lower the weights down towards the chest, and then press the weights back up to the starting position. This lifting and lowering of this weight that the body is unaccustomed to lifting, or in other words, activity that is higher than the demand of daily activity, is the stimulus that is depicted in the picture. So where you see the word stimulus with the arrow going to it. This unaccustomed stress of lifting and lowering the dumbbells causes fatigue as the body tries to respond to the demands placed on the bones, joints, muscles, and tendons. The body, however, has many protective processes aimed to maintain homeostasis. Therefore, during recovery, the body will adapt or compensate for the stresses placed on the body. You may have noticed the little bump in the graph labeled overcompensation. The human body is highly effective at bringing itself back to homeostasis, and in this instance, the body will actually overcompensate for the stress placed on the body before returning to a homeostatic state. Let's now move on to the time component of the FITT-VP principle. The ACSM does not have a specific duration of time that they recommend for resistance training for sedentary, healthy adults. Let's now look at the second T of the FITT-VP principle, or the type of recommended resistance training exercises. The ACSM recommends that sedentary, healthy adults perform multi-joint exercises affecting 1 or more muscle groups that target agonist and antagonist muscle groups. Single joint exercises targeting major muscle groups can also be included. The major muscle groups are the chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps, abdomen, quadriceps, and hamstrings. 8 to 10 exercises should be performed targeting these major muscle groups. And again, it should be noted that the agonist muscle is the prime mover, or the muscle that causes a body part to move when contracted. And again, the antagonist muscle is a muscle that relaxes while the agonist contracts. So, for example, during a bicep curl, the biceps are the agonist muscle, the one contracting, and the triceps are the antagonist muscle, the ones that are relaxing. So here's a nice table with different types of resistance training exercises. And the table is broken into 3 different categories. So you have free weight exercises, pictured on the left. In the middle are machine-based exercises. And to the right are body weight exercises. And I know some of these terms might be unfamiliar to some of you, but I thought it was a good table to include to show you different exercises from the ACSM recommendations. Now onto the V of the FITT-VP principle, or the recommendations for volume of resistance training. The ACSM recommends that a person perform 2 to 4 sets per muscle group during a training session. This could be accomplished by performing the same exercise for 2 to 4 sets, or by doing, say, 2 different exercises that both target the same muscle group, for example, the shoulders, for 2 sets each. These exercises should be performed for 8 to 12 repetitions. The intensity of resistance training and the number of repetitions are inversely related. That means that if you are lifting a weight that is very hard for you, or a higher percentage of your 1 RM, then you would perform less repetitions, let's say 6 to 8. This lower rep range will focus more on muscular mass and strength gains. The opposite is also true. If the weight you're using is not as challenging, then you would want to perform closer to the end of the range at 12 repetitions. This would improve muscular strength and to some extent muscular endurance. Also, it is important to understand that you do not need to perform the same number of repetitions each set. As the muscles begin to fatigue from an exercise, the number of reps completed may also decrease. For example, you may perform 2 sets of 12 shoulder raises and decrease to 10 repetitions on the 3rd set at the same weight as the previous 2 sets. The goal is to overload the muscle enough to cause fatigue by the end of the exercise, so that the last few reps are challenging, but not so hard that the muscles begin to fail. It is then recommended that a person rest for 2 to 3 minutes between sets. It should be noted that these recommendations are for sedentary, healthy adults to improve overall strength. For individuals interested in solely endurance, hypertrophy, or power resistance training, the recommendations are much more detailed in terms of number of repetitions, rest intervals, and sets of exercises. This recommendation is aimed to improve general fitness levels and improve functionality. We are now on the last letter of the FITT-VP principle, or the progression of resistance training recommended. The ACSM recommends that resistance training should be progressed gradually in terms of frequency, intensity, or volume of the exercise. We're now going to look at the principles of overload, specificity, and variation. It should be noted that progression of exercise is highly dependent on the individual and how they respond to training. In the earlier intensity slide, I talked about how during the overload principle, an unaccustomed stress acts as a stimulus to the body to respond to the demands placed on it. These unaccustomed demands cause fatigue, which the body compensates for during recovery in order to return to a homeostatic state. The principle of progressive overload states that the body must have a stimulus that is harder than a person is accustomed to, or in other words, an overload, in order to gain strength. As the muscles adapt and become stronger, the stimulus must gradually increase in order to elicit greater strength increases. In a practical resistance training setting, this would mean a person would need to lift a heavier weight than they're accustomed to. The ACSM recommends that a person increase the intensity of exercise by 2 to 10% of their 1 RM after they are able to complete 1 to 2 reps over the recommended repetitions for 2 consecutive training sessions. The lower end of the range, or closer to 2% increase, is for smaller muscle groups. And the higher end of the range, or closer to 10% increase, is for larger muscle groups. Now, let's look at the picture at the bottom. This is a great way to visualize what the principle implies. You can see that the boy starts by carrying a small calf on his shoulder. As the calf becomes larger, it has gradually caused an overload on the boy's muscles that he has had to adapt to. The boy, in turn, became stronger as the bull grew because he was continuously challenged to carry a heavier load as the bull grew bigger. This represents progressive overload. It should be noted, however, that overloading the muscles too quickly or too much can lead to injury. Progression of exercise should be gradual and be from an increase in either the frequency of training, the volume of exercise, or the duration of training. The ACSM recommends that a person consistently resistance train for 6 months before progressing. Let's look at the progression of resistance training in terms of specificity. The principle of specificity states that training responses and adaptations are correlated to the type, frequency, and duration of exercise performed. So a person must ask themselves, what is the goal of their training? Because once they know their goal, they can then adapt their training in order to reach that goal by choosing different types of exercises, different frequencies and durations of exercises performed. So, for instance, a marathon runner or someone that runs long distances would train quite differently than, say, a bodybuilder or someone who's looking to gain a lot of muscle mass. So once a person establishes their goal of, say, being a marathoner or being a bodybuilder or whatever their goal may be, they can then choose appropriate types of exercises, an appropriate frequency of training, and an appropriate duration of exercises performed. Before we go farther into the progression of resistance training, let's go over a few terms. Muscular endurance is the ability of a muscle or muscle group to repeatedly exert a submaximal resistance. Muscular strength is the ability of a muscle or muscle group to exert a maximal force. Muscular hypertrophy is the enlargement of muscle size. And muscular power is the maximum power output attainable during a movement, or in other words, explosiveness. Now let's look at the progression of resistance training in order to increase muscular endurance. Again, muscular endurance is the ability of a muscle or muscle group to repeatedly exert a submaximal resistance. The ACSM recommends that the intensity is less than 70% of a person's 1 RM. They perform 2 to 4 sets with repetitions between 10 to 25 reps, so a high rep range. And they rest 30 seconds to 1 minute between sets. Now onto the progression of resistance training in order to increase muscular strength. So if someone really wanted to get stronger and that was their goal, the ACSM recommends that the intensity be 60 to 70% of their 1 RM, that they perform 1 to 3 sets with repetitions between 8 to 12, and they rest 2 to 3 minutes between sets. The progression of exercise in order to increase muscular hypertrophy. The ACSM recommends that the intensity be 70 to 85% of the 1 RM, or 1 repetition maximum, that a person complete 1 to 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions and rest 2 to 3 minutes between sets. So a higher intensity than was noted for muscular endurance and muscular strength. And finally, the recommendations for progression of resistance training if a person's goal is muscular power. The ACSM recommends that the intensity be 0, or body weight in other words, to 60% of a person's 1 RM. That a person perform 1 to 3 sets of 3 to 6 repetitions and rest 2 to 3 minutes in between sets. And again, muscular power is the maximum power output attainable during a movement, or a lot of people like to call it explosiveness. Let's move on to an example comparing the 4 different categories we just talked about. So muscular endurance, muscular strength, muscular hypertrophy, and muscular power. So these could be 4 different goals that a person had. And for this example, it should be noted that a person's 1 RM, or 1 repetition maximum, is 100 pounds, which also equals 45.4 kilograms. So let's start with muscular endurance. The recommended intensity was less than 70% of a person's 1 RM, and that would correlate to 70 pounds or 31.8 kilograms or less. The sets would be 2 to 4 sets. A person would perform 10 to 25 repetitions, and they would rest 30 to 60 seconds. Now, if a person's goal was muscular strength and their 1 RM was 100 pounds, they would perform exercises with an intensity of, say, 60 to 70 pounds, or 27.2 to 31.8 kilograms. They would perform less sets, so 1 to 3 sets. The repetitions would also be less, say 8 to 12 repetitions, but they would rest for a greater amount, 2 to 3 minutes. If a person's goal was muscular hypertrophy, they would train at 70 to 85% of their 1 RM, which would correlate to 70 to 85 pounds, or 31.8 to 38.6 kilograms. And they would perform 1 to 3 sets with 8 to 12 repetitions and rest 2 to 3 minutes. So if you're looking at muscular hypertrophy versus muscular strength, you can see that even though the sets, reps, and rest are the same, what's different is that a person's training at a higher intensity, so a higher percentage of their 1 RM. So 70 to 85% of their 1 RM compared to, with muscular strength, 60 to 70% of their 1 RM. And finally, let's move on to muscular power. So if a person's goal was to improve their explosiveness, they would perform either body weight or up to 60% of their 1 RM in intensity, which would correlate to either body weight exercises or 60 pounds or 27.2 kilograms. It's recommended that they perform 1 to 3 sets of 3 to 6 repetitions, so the least repetitions of all 4 of the categories, and that they rest 2 to 3 minutes in between sets. Finally, let's move on to the progression of resistance training in terms of variation. Resistance training sessions can be varied in multiple ways. A person could vary the type of movement they perform, so concentric versus eccentric versus isometric movements. They could vary the types of exercises they select in a workout. For instance, they could utilize more single versus multi-joint movements, or they could do exercises on unstable surfaces if they wanted to work their core or balance more. Or they could even utilize doing the same exercise, but using free weights versus machines. And finally, variation can come into play through periodization. And periodization is a training program that is broken down into smaller progressive stages. This is great for athletes, for example, that have training seasons and then off seasons, because then they could periodize their training to accommodate when they're in season versus when they're out of season. Here is a summary of the ACSM's recommendations for resistance training based on the FITT-VP principle.